Our speaker tonight is Dr. Michael Behe. Dr. Behe received his PhD in biochemistry from the University of Pennsylvania in 1978. He then went on to the National Institutes of Health, where he did postdoctoral work, and he is currently a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University, where his research focuses on DNA structure, especially particular sequences of nucleotides. He's the author of Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution, which has caused quite a stir over the past year. And he's going to talk for about an hour, and after that we're going to have questions. Because we are videotaping, we ask that you come and line up at these two microphones so that we can hear the questions and preserve them for posterity. Think hard what you want to say. And now, without further ado, let's introduce and welcome Dr. Michael Behe.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm going to turn this on because it takes a minute to warm up. In the 17th and 18th century, science was making a lot of progress, and in particularly biology was. The anatomy of a lot of animals were being compared, plants as well, and scientists began to notice that there were a number of resemblances between different animals. And the theory of common descent began to be discussed. But nobody could even guess what might cause transformations of the magnitude that would be necessary. But in 1859, Charles Darwin published his elegant theory of evolution by natural selection. And what Darwin proposed was that he noticed that there was variation in all species of animals. And he also knew that there was not enough food for all organisms that were born to survive and reproduce. And he reasoned then that the organisms whose chance variation gave them an edge in the struggle to survive would in fact outcompete their siblings and survive and leave offspring. And if the variation could be inherited, then perhaps over time the characteristics of the species would change. And perhaps over great periods of time, great changes could occur. So Darwin had hit upon something that nobody thought could be done, a simple, elegant mechanism of evolution. But even in the 19th century, a number of scientists thought that there were structures in nature which might not be able to be explained by this theory. And in one in particular was the eye. It was noticed that the eye was a complex structure composed of the retina and the lens and ocular muscles and needed tear ducts. And if any of these structures were missing, then the person or animal would be, their vision would be severely compromised, or it might be outright blind. Well, Charles Darwin knew about the eye too, and he dealt with the eye in a section of The Origin of Species called Organs of Extreme Perfection and Complication. And Darwin said essentially, well, he didn't know how the eye might have evolved. But, he said, if you look at various eyes in current organisms in nature, you might begin to be able to see how such a transformation might occur. And he said, some simple organisms have a very simple light-sensitive structure. Here's some light-sensitive cells surrounded by pigment cells. In such a structure, it hardly could be said to be an eye, light coming from any direction could set off the light-sensitive cells. So the organism could sense light and dark, but it can't really sense which direction the light is coming from. However, if you take this light-sensitive spot and put it in a little cup, as is seen in other organisms, then light coming from one direction will cast a shadow on the retina, and so this might give the animal a sense of direction from which the light is coming. And if you deepen the cup and start to fill it with a gelatinous material, then that's the beginnings of a crude lens. And so Darwin argued that there might be a pathway, an evolutionary pathway, from something like a simple light-sensitive spot all the way up to the complicated eye of vertebrates. And his argument persuaded many of his contemporaries and really carried the day. But where did the light-sensitive spot come from? Darwin didn't know. And as a matter of fact, in The Origin, he specifically declined to address that question. He wrote, "How a nerve comes to be sensitive to light hardly concerns us more than how life itself originated." Well, in modern science has become interested in both of these questions. But Darwin was right. He was right to not even try to answer this question, because the science of the 19th century didn't have the tools to even to begin to investigate it. To give you an idea, in Darwin's time, atoms and molecules were theoretical entities. Nobody knew if such things actually existed. The cell was thought to be a little piece of undifferentiated protoplasm, kind of like a little piece of microscopic jello. And many people thought that the cell was a very simple apparatus. And in fact, it was what I term a black box. And of course, a black box means a system or a machine that does something, but you don't know how it works. Excuse me, either because you can't see the insides of the black box, or because it's so complicated you can't figure out how it might function. So Darwin was really right to decline to try to address the question in the 19th century. And that's fine. The only problem is that it seems to be a trait of human psychology that when we see a black box in action, we kind of assume that it's simple. The insides are simple. How it works is simple. And we can see that in various areas, and here's an example. There's good old Calvin and Hobbes. And Calvin finds it easy to believe that a box might fly like an airplane. He thinks airplanes are just, like tubes and they have flaps, and well, this has flaps. And if he jumps in it and the wind comes along, maybe he can take off. But when Calvin grows up and becomes an engineer and sells out, he learns that airplanes are very, very complicated machines, and he will no longer easily be able to imagine himself doing this. In many ways, science is the same way. It thought that the cell, the black box that it encountered in Darwin's day, would be very simple. But further investigation over the past, especially the past 50 years, has shown that far from being the case, that the cell is enormously complex. So let's return to Darwin's question of how a nerve becomes sensitive to light. What makes a cell able to detect light? And see what progress science has made in the past 100 years or so. When a photon first hits your retina, it interacts with a molecule called 11-cis-retinal. That's kind of in a bent shape like this, in an L. And when the photon is absorbed, it straightens out. And that's the first event in a long pathway of events that proceed on to vision. This is much of the rest of the pathway. This is not to the same scale as the last figure. The retinal probably occupies about a third the length of this oval. The retinal is bound to a protein called rhodopsin. Here is designated RH. It's supposed to be this oval. And the change in the shape of the retinal forces a change in the shape of the protein rhodopsin to which it's bound. When the rhodopsin changes shape, it acquires the ability to interact with a protein called transducin. Previously, transducin had bound a small organic molecule called GDP, but when rhodopsin binds, it the GDP falls off and a related molecule called GTP binds. When that happens, the complex of rhodopsin, transducin, GTP acquires the ability to interact with phosphodiesterase, this little circle here. When it does that, the phosphodiesterase, the shape of the phosphodiesterase is changed so that it now starts to chemically cut a molecule called cyclic GMP, turning it into 5' GMP. Now, there's a lot of cyclic GMP in the cell, and some interacts with this, and some interacts with another protein called an ion channel. But when the ion channel allows sodium ions from the outside into the inside of the cell. When the phosphodiesterase starts to cleave the cyclic GMP, it lowers the concentration of it, and that causes the cyclic GMP on the ion channel to fall off. When that happens, the ion channel closes down, the concentration of sodium in the cell changes. That changes the voltage across the membrane, and that eventually causes a current to be sent down the optical nerve to the brain. And when interpreted by the brain, that is vision. So this is the simple light-sensitive spot that Darwin started his speculation in the origin with. Now, believe me, this is just a sketch of the chemistry of vision. It goes into a lot more detail than that. For example, the system that returns the state to its original position and restores retinal to its correct conformation and so on. So this looks very complicated, but can it be explained by Darwin's theory? It turns out that Darwin himself gave us a criterion by which we could judge whether something is explainable by his theory of natural selection. In the origin, he wrote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." Well, okay, what kind of a system could not be formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications? Excuse me. Well, for starters, one that is what I call irreducibly complex, or has the property of irreducible complexity. Now, irreducible complexity is just a phrase I made up to make people think that I'm smart. But it actually can be demonstrated by a relatively simple example. This is a mousetrap. A mousetrap consists of a number of different parts. It's got a wooden platform, which holds the other pieces. It's got a spring with extended ends that press against the platform here and against this little bar, which is called the hammer, which actually does the job of squashing the mouse. Now, when you push the hammer over here, you have to hold it in place with the holding bar, and the end of the holding bar inserts into something that's called the catch. Now, all of these pieces are needed for the mousetrap to work, and that's what we mean by irreducible complexity. You can't have just the platform and catch a mouse, and add the spring and catch a few more mice, and add the holding bar and catch mice more efficiently. You've got to have everything in place at once, or you don't catch any mice at all. If you have a mousetrap missing the spring, or missing the hammer, or missing the catch, it doesn't work 50% as well as an intact mousetrap, or 25% as well, or 10% as well. It's broken. It doesn't work at all. An irreducibly complex system like this is a big challenge to Darwinian evolution because, because natural selection needs a function to select. And for irreducibly complex systems, the function does not appear until the system is intact. Well, mousetraps are one thing, but are there any irreducibly complex biochemical systems? Cells or systems in the cell? Yes, it turns out the cell is loaded with such things. And an example of one is shown here. Here's an electron micrograph of some lung tissue. And lining the lungs are cells that have all these little hair-like organelles sticking out of them. They're called cilia. And the cilia beat in synchrony like this, like the oars of a Roman galley. And these big cells here are called goblet cells, and they secrete mucus. And the beating of the cilia sweeps the mucus up towards your throat where you can cough it out. Hope I don't offend anybody. This is biology, blood and guts. And that's good because when you get dust particles or whatever in your lungs, this is a mechanism to clear your lungs out. Now, these cilia look pretty simple, but we should be suspicious. Why do they beat like this? The hairs on my head don't beat like that. It would be entertaining if they did, but they don't. How does that work? How does the cilium do that? Well, it turns out that biochemical investigations over the past quarter century or so have shown that the cilium is a very complex molecular machine. And here's, on the bottom part of this transparency, is shown a cross-section through one of the cilia. And as you can see, it's pretty complex. It consists of 9 what are called double microtubules. And each one of these double microtubules, one of the rings consists of 13 different strands of a protein called tubulin, and the other one consists of 10 strands of the protein called tubulin. They're connected to each other by a number of links. There's a small link here called nexin, and here's a radial spoke linking the double microtubules into the central single microtubules. And the central single microtubules are connected to each other by a connecting bridge. Additionally, attached to the microtubules are a couple of arms. This is called the outer dynein arm and the inner dynein arm. And even though this looks complex, it really doesn't convey the full complexity of the cilium. Biochemical investigation shows that a typical cilium consists of over 200 different kinds of protein parts. Well, that's what it looks like, but how does it work? It turns out that the cilium works by what's called a sliding fiber mechanism, and that's shown in a little cartoon drawing down here. The microtubules are next to each other, and the dynein is what is called a motor protein. Dynein hooks onto one microtubule, reaches over and grabs onto the other one and pushes it down. And when it pushes it down, it would just slide apart and fall apart, except that the nexin linker is there, and as it starts to slide, the nexin linker begins to get taut. And as it slides a little bit more, the strain becomes greater, and as it pushes more, it tilts. And it reverses direction and tilts the other way, and back and forth. And that's essentially the mechanism by which the ciliary motion is generated. Now, perhaps you can see that the cilium is irreducibly complex. If it were not for the microtubule sliding fibers, there would be nothing to generate the motion, nothing to beat. If it were not for the nexin, when the dynein started to push them apart, they would just fall apart, as happens in experiments when the nexin linkers are removed. If it were not for the dynein motor proteins, the apparatus would lie stiff and motionless, kind of like in rigor mortis. So again, a cilium, an irreducibly complex structure, is a big challenge for Darwinian evolution because one does not get the function of the cilium until the ciliary components are in place. Let's look at another example of irreducible complexity. And this is kind of like the first one, but significantly different. And it's called a bacterial flagellum. The bacterial flagellum is literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim through solution. It's a rotary device. And this is the propeller surface, and it rotates. And it's held onto the drive shaft here by this universal joint made up of something called hook protein. And the apparatus is held in place in the bacterial membrane by this stator. And the motor this is a rotary motor, which is the rotating part, which turns the drive shaft, which turns the propeller. And it has to go through the bacterial membrane, so there are a number of different bushing proteins to allow it to penetrate the membrane. Genetic studies have shown that over 50 different separate protein parts are required to produce a flagellum. About 20 go into making up the structure of the flagellum, and another 30 are needed to coordinate the genes to turn on and off at the right time in order to build this massive structure within the bacterium. The flagellum is irreducibly complex too. If it's not for the propeller, you would not get any motion when it rotated. If it's not for the stator, the device would rotate in the membrane itself, and of course, not for the motor or the bushing proteins, the device would not work either. In the absence of any of those 50 different components, you do not get a flagellum that works half as well or a quarter as well again. You have a broken flagellum. I'd just like to point out that I like to use this illustration, which is from a popular biochemistry textbook written by Voet and Voet, because when people look at this, they can immediately see that this is a machine. It's not like a machine, it is a machine. Now, there are many other examples of such systems which have this property of irreducible complexity and which are subsequently a strong challenge to Darwinian gradualism. The way that Darwin thought his theory would have to work. But, you know, I did not work out the structure of these things. I didn't do it in my laboratory. This was work done by many, many different laboratories, working hard over several decades. If these things can't be explained by Darwin's theory, as I propose, what have other scientists had to say about how these things could be put together? I'm glad you asked. A good place to look for an answer to that question is in a place called the Journal of Molecular Evolution. Now, as its name implies, this is a scientific journal that was set up specifically to investigate the question of how life might have been produced at the molecular level. It's a good journal. It's on its editorial board there are about 50 prominent scientists. Of those, maybe a dozen are members of the National Academy of Sciences, an occasional Nobel laureate or two. Now, in a recent issue of the Journal of Molecular Evolution, there were published about 15 papers. Now, I don't think you can read them from where you're sitting, and even if you could, perhaps many of you wouldn't understand what the titles implied. Let me just say that these 15 papers all have to do with something called sequence analysis. Now, in sequence analysis, you look at a protein or a piece of DNA. Now, protein is made up of a string of amino acids, and DNA is made up of a chain of nucleotides. And one thing one can do is take a protein from one species and look at its amino acid sequence, and take something that looks to be similar from another species and check out its amino acid sequence and compare the two. And this is a good way to determine how related two species might be. And it's very interesting work. But I'd just like to point out that this cannot address the question of how complex biochemical systems, such as we just saw here, could have come into existence step by Darwinian step. Let me give you an analogy. You can take two animals and compare their anatomy. You can say, well, this bone looks to be in the same position as this bone, and this one is the same relative position as that bone. And that can give you a good indication of how related the two animals are. But it does not address the question of where bones came from in the first place. So we're interested in here in what is the mechanism, what is the origin of these complex structures. In the past 10 years, the Journal of Molecular Evolution has published about 1,000 papers. Of those 1,000, about 800 are sequence analyses. About 100 have to do with studies of chemicals thought to be necessary for the origin of life. And about 50 are mathematical studies to improve sequence analysis. Of those 1,000 papers, how many propose models whereby, for the gradual evolution of complex biochemical structures, such as we talked about? It's a round number. There weren't any. There are none. Zero. Zip. It's not what you would expect from a journal with the name Journal of Molecular Evolution. If you look in other journals, Journal of Molecular Biology, Proceedings National Academy of Sciences, the story is pretty much the same. Sequence analysis predominate, but there are extremely few, if any, studies on how complex biochemical structures might have been put together. Well, if that's the case, why do scientists believe in Darwinian evolution? Well, I don't know. I don't. But at least one part of the answer is that they're taught to believe that. And many textbooks, of course, teach biology from the Darwinian perspective, and they seek to imbue in their students the ability to see the world through a Darwinian lens. And a good example of that teaching is also seen in the textbook by Voet and Voet that I referred to earlier. And in the early part of the textbook, they really have a wonderful drawing which captures the orthodox view of how life was produced on Earth. And this is it. Let me just, is this where you? In the upper third of the drawing, there's a volcano and lightning and little rays of sunlight and an ocean. And that's how life started. And then leading out from the origin of life ocean and into a bacterial cell is a schematic of DNA, and that is how life developed. And at the bottom third, no kidding, it's the Garden of Eden. A number of animals that have been produced by evolution are milling about. In the center are a couple of soap opera stars here. Notice that the woman is handing the man an apple. But if you look in that textbook for details of how these processes happened, you won't find them. They're not there. And that's not surprising because they're not in the primary literature either. Now, Darwin, in The Origin of Species, at a number of points, appealed to the imagination of his readers, saying that our minds, our imagination has to fill in what is lacking in the data. But imagination is a two-edged sword. An imaginative person might see things that other people miss, or he might see things that aren't there. A review of the literature shows that Darwinian evolution has become stuck in the region of imagination. Now, of course, textbooks also like to present positive evidence excuse me, for evolution. And also in this textbook is a good example of what can be marshaled in favor of Darwinian evolution. And early in the book is shown a figure of some embryos first drawn by Ernst Haeckel in the late 19th century. How many folks here have seen a drawing like that? Okay, yeah, most people have, and as well they should. It's good evidence for the Darwinian side. And Haeckel showed that the early vertebrate embryos strongly resemble each other. and that it's only in their later forms that they go on to diverge. And he reasoned that that should be the case because the early stages of embryogenesis affect everything in the later stages. And to tinker with that would be to court disaster. And so that evolution would have to proceed by modifying later and later stages. And that is in another textbook, Molecular Biology of the Cell, which is written by Bruce Alberts, who is the president of the National Academy of Sciences, and James Watson, who is, of course, the Nobel laureate with Francis Crick for the structure of DNA. They reiterate this understanding. And they say, let's look at the last sentence. The early cells of an embryo are like cards at the bottom of a house of cards. A great deal depends on them, and even small changes in their properties are likely to result in disaster. So the fact that these are conserved is, in fact, very consistent with the predictions of Darwinism, as Bruce Alberts and James Watson argue. There's just one problem. The embryos don't look like that. Ernst Haeckel faked the data. In an article was published in a journal called Anatomy and Embryology about a month ago and was written up in Science magazine. These are Haeckel's drawings of the embryos down here, and this is what the embryos look like. In the article, the science writer, Elizabeth Panisi, observes, not only did Haeckel add or omit features, but he also fudges the scale to exaggerate similarities among species, even when there were tenfold differences in size. Haeckel further blurred differences by neglecting to name the species in most cases, as if one representative was accurate for an entire group of animals. In reality, even closely related embryos, such as those of fish, vary quite a bit in their appearance and developmental pathway. It looks like it's turning out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology, Richardson concludes. Richardson was the investigator who did the study. Our imaginations have to fill in much of the gaps, but sometimes, as in the case of Ernst Haeckel, our imaginations can turn against us and lead us astray. Now, my criticisms of evolution, or of Darwinian evolution, irreducible complexity and such things, and even the problems of embryogenesis, have been pointed out by a number of other scientists. Lynn Margulis and Stuart Kaufman come to mind, James Shapiro. But where I differ, and where I guess has gotten some attention, is that I say these structures look like they were designed, purposely designed by an intelligent agent. And that certainly has set off things. Critics quickly say, well, that's a religious conclusion. Be he you're a Christian, you believe in God, you're reading your religious beliefs into your science. And I disagree with that. I think the conclusion of design is a scientific one, an empirical one, based completely on the observable system, plus an appreciation for how we come to a conclusion of design ordinarily. And to see how that is the case, let's take a look at this next transparency. Here's the far side. A group of jungle explorers, and this poor guy has been strung up and skewered. And this guy turns to this one and says, "That's why I never walk in front." I have had reason to sympathize with that. Now, everyone in this auditorium looks at this cartoon, and you immediately know that this was designed. That's no accident. His death was intended. In fact, the humor of the cartoon depends on you recognizing the design. How do you know that? How do you know that this is designed? You know it's designed because you see a number of different parts interacting with great specificity to perform a function that none of the parts themselves could perform. Essentially, irreducible complexity. Far from being a religious conclusion, it's based simply on the observable parts of the system. Let's leave this up a few minutes and ask a few more questions about this situation. When was this system designed? I don't know, can't tell. It might have been designed an hour ago, a week ago, a month ago. You can't tell when exactly it was designed without gathering further information. But you can tell just from the interaction of parts that, in fact, it was designed. Who designed this system? Well, you might guess that maybe a resident of the jungle designed the trap to keep out nosy explorers. But what if I told you this guy assembled it? He snuck out of camp last week and put it up on a route he knew that the party would be taking, and he made sure he was not the first one walking along. The point is, you can't tell who designed the trap just by looking at it. But you sure as shootin' can tell that the trap was, in fact, designed. One more question. Where is this trap? Well, it's in a jungle somewhere, but where? Suppose I told you that these guys were not just jungle explorers, they were space explorers. And they have just taken a rocket ship to a planet light years from the Earth, a planet never before explored by humanity, got out, and this happened. Now who designed the trap? Was it him? Was it a space alien? Maybe. You can't tell, but you can certainly tell that the trap was designed. Now, let me skip ahead. As I said, my argument against Darwinian mechanism is not new. The conclusion of design is new, and that seems to have gotten some attention because my book has been reviewed by a large number of publications. Everywhere from the New York Times to the Allentown Morning Call. That's my hometown, hey. And from Christianity Today to Skeptic magazine. Everybody gets a crack at it. Among those reviews have been a number by biologists. What have they had to say about these arguments? Well, first off, all of the reviewers, all of the biological reviewers, have admitted that the systems I described are enormously complex and currently unexplained. For example, in the New York Times, James Shreve writes, "Mr. Behe may be right that given our current state of knowledge, good old Darwinian evolution cannot explain the origin of blood clotting or cellular transport." James Shapiro, a biochemist from the University of Chicago, writing in National Review, says, "There are no detailed Darwinian accounts for the evolution of any fundamental biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations." And Jerry Coyne, an evolutionary biologist from Chicago, although writing a very strongly negative review, nonetheless says, "There is no doubt, that the pathways described by Behe are dauntingly complex, and their evolution will be hard to unravel. We may forever be unable to envisage the first proto-pathways." And that's my favorite one there. Can you tell? Can you tell? Okay, so how many of those folks agree with me that intelligent design is correct? Any guesses? Nobody. Nobody does. And what are their reasons for thinking that design is not correct? James Shreve writes, "Shouldn't we leave something for our children and grandchildren to puzzle out, besides which systems in the cell are intelligently designed and which are not?" James Shapiro writes, "Sadly, Despite its valuable critique of an all too often unchallenged orthodoxy, Darwin's black box fails to capture the true excitement of contemporary biology because it is fighting the battles of the past rather than seeing the vision of the future. Sounds like a political campaign. And Jerry Coyne writes, it is not valid, however, to assume that because one man cannot imagine such pathways, they could not have existed, neglecting to see that it is in fact the whole scientific community which cannot imagine those pathways to have occurred. So, in my opinion at least, these are not really scientific reasons for dismissing the idea of intelligent design. They seem more to be philosophical or somehow related to other concerns. Why are scientists reluctant to embrace a theory of intelligent design? Well, again, I'm not no psychologist or anything, but I think part of the answer has to do with this. They think that a theory of intelligent design strongly implicates something beyond nature. And they think for one reason or another that that is not good science, either because they think science should not invoke theories which implicate the supernatural, or because they are quite candidly hostile to the idea of something beyond nature. So I'd like to address the first question and ask the question, can science propose a theory which has what many people think to be strongly theological or implications for something beyond nature? And I would like to argue that, in fact, yes, one can propose such a theory, and you can have a very successful scientific theory that has such implications. And furthermore, I'd like to ask another question, and that is this proposal of design in biology and biochemistry, does it stick out like a sore thumb? Is it something that does not fit into science, or is it compatible, or does it point in the same direction as developments from other areas of science? And of course, I'd like to argue that, in fact, it does do that. And so I'd like to consider three other areas of science briefly. The first is the origin of the universe. The second, what are called anthropic coincidences. And the third, the problem of the origin of life. Now, people forget that it was only about 70 years or so ago that science thought the universe was eternal and essentially unchanging. But then the motion of the stars away from the Earth and away from each other was observed. And this was the beginning of the Big Bang theory. Now, the Big Bang theory struck many people as having pretty strong theological implications. Maybe this was the creation, the beginning of everything. And many of those people didn't like the idea. For example, an astronomer named Arthur Eddington wrote half a century ago, philosophically, the notion of an abrupt beginning to the present order of nature is repugnant to me. So he does not like this scientific theory because it is philosophically unappealing. Well, that was half a century ago. But it turns out that these sentiments persist strongly into the present day. And that is shown by a remarkable editorial published in the journal Nature, the leading science journal in the world, in the year 1989. The editor of Nature, then a man named John Mannix, wrote an editorial entitled, "Down with the Big Bang." And in it he wrote, apart from being philosophically unacceptable, the Big Bang is an oversimple view of how the universe began, and it is unlikely to survive the decade ahead. Well, we've got 2 years to go and seems to be doing okay, but that's not really the question. Further on in his article, he goes on to say, creationists, and by creationists, he doesn't mean simply young Earth creationists, but anybody who believes there is a being such as God who creates. Creationists and those of similar persuasions seeking support for their opinions have ample justification in the doctrine of the Big Bang. So my point here is simply to say that the Big Bang theory has struck many people as having strong theological implications, including many people who did not like those implications. But nonetheless, it has been a very fruitful scientific theory firmly grounded in the empirical facts. The next point is what are called the anthropic coincidences. Several decades ago, it was noticed that many features of the universe seem to be really remarkably fine-tuned to allow for the existence of life. That if the charge on the electron or the gravitational constant had been different by a smidgen, the universe would not have developed in a way that would allow life to exist. And this has been talked about quite a bit. Perhaps we can just look at a couple quotes from some popular books written by physicists. Here's one written by Paul Davies. He writes, "The numerical values that nature has assigned to the fundamental constants, such as the charge on the electron, the mass of the proton, and the Newtonian gravitational constant, may be mysterious, but they are crucially relevant to the structure of the universe that we perceive. More intriguing still, certain crucial structures, such as solar-type stars, depend for their characteristic features on wildly improbable numerical accidents that combine together fundamental constants from distinct branches of physics. Recent discoveries about the primeval cosmos oblige us to accept that the expanding universe has been set up in its motion with a cooperation of astonishing precision." And the mathematician Roger Penrose, commenting upon these anthropic coincidences, has written that this now tells us how precise the Creator's aim must have been, namely to an accuracy of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. This is an extraordinary figure. One could not possibly even write the number down. It turns out that these coincidences extend beyond the simple, basic constants of the universe. For example, the production of carbon. Our bodies are made of carbon. All life depends on it. But carbon was not produced in the Big Bang. Carbon and other elements heavier than helium are thought to have been made inside stars in the nuclear reactions that power them. It turns out that those nuclear reactions depend on things called resonance levels. And the production of carbon depends on the fortuitous placement of resonance levels for the elements of hydrogen, beryllium, and carbon. Now, in the 1940s, carbon was not known to have a resonance level at the necessary position. But Fred Hoyle, a physicist, reasoning backwards from the existence of life, said that he predicted that a resonance level should appear at a certain point. And he persuaded some experimentalists to look for that resonance level. And to their astonishment, they found it. And this has led Hoyle to exclaim, "If you wanted to produce carbon and oxygen in roughly equal quantities by stellar nucleosynthesis, these are the 2 levels you would have to fix. And your fixing would have to be just about where these levels are actually found to be. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question." This is made even more compelling when one reads that Hoyle was in fact an atheist and proposed the steady-state theory, a rival to the Big Bang theory for a long time, because he was philosophically distressed by the theological implications of the Big Bang theory. And the final example I want to talk about is the origin of life. And perhaps many of you will recognize this drawing, or something similar to it. It's a drawing of an apparatus like that used by Stanley Miller in the early 1950s. Stanley Miller was a graduate student at the University of Chicago when he decided to investigate whether amino acids could have been produced on the early Earth. And he filled a bulb with gases of hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and water vapor, and sparked the mixture over a week's time or so and refluxed the water. And at the end of the week, he withdrew some of the material. And he saw that about 98% of it was gunk, but about 2% of it was amino acids. And this was very exciting to science. And people at the time imagined that further experiments would show how these amino acids could be put together to form proteins, excuse me, how nucleotides could be formed, and how they could be put together to form nucleic acids. And pretty soon we would have a good idea of how the first cell arose by natural processes. But life has not been kind to that point of view, and a number of problems have cropped up with it, which I don't really have time to discuss. But writing in a book a couple years ago, Stanley Miller stated that, to date, no highly efficient, prebiotically plausible process for the polymerization of amino acids to form peptides or of mixtures of purines, pyrimidines, and ribose to form ribonucleotides have been found. Translated into English, this means that despite 45 years of research, we are no closer to discovering how proteins or DNA or any other complicated biochemical polymer might be put together by undirected chemical reactions. In recent years, a new theory has been put forward called the RNA world, in which it is suggested that RNA was the first biological molecule, not protein, as Stanley Miller supposed. But the problems with synthesizing RNA under origin of life conditions make the synthesis of proteins look like a walk in the park. And this has been forthrightly admitted to by Gerald Joyce and Leslie Orgel, two origin of life researchers who have worked long and hard on the problem. And they write that scientists interested in the origin of life seem to divide neatly into two classes. The first, usually, but not always, molecular biologists, believe that RNA must have been the first replicating molecule, and that chemists are exaggerating the difficulties of nucleotide synthesis. The second group of scientists are much more pessimistic. They believe that the de novo appearance of oligonucleotides on the primitive Earth would have been a near miracle. The authors subscribe to this latter view. Time will tell which is correct. That's not my comment, that's their comment in parentheses. Now, Leslie Orgel and Gerald Joyce do not believe in intelligent design. Instead, they propose that, in fact, RNA was not the first replicating molecule. Instead, they propose that something else was the first replicating molecule. So now we have something which goes on to produce RNA, which goes on to produce protein and DNA. So scientists in the origin of life field continue to add epicycles to their theory of the origin of life without making noticeable progress in the laboratory. Now, Orgel and Joyce, of course, are in the field, and when you're in the field, you're going to solve that problem no matter what. But other scientists have been less reluctant to give an honest assessment of where research in the field stands. For example, the cell biologist Franklin Harold wrote recently in the journal Microbiology, "The origin of life stands as the most profound mystery in biology." And we note in passing that despite all the achievements of investigators in prebiotic biochemistry, it remains utterly beyond our comprehension. So, all of this is to put the idea of irreducible complexity and design in biochemistry into perspective. It is not something that seems to be going against the grain of modern science. On the contrary, it seems to fit in pretty well with what science is learning from other branches. The origin of the universe, the anthropic coincidences, the origin of life, all of these seem to point in the same direction, that somehow the universe and life were intended, that they are the product of intelligent activity. And I'd just like to point out that this this idea comes from the progress of science. It is not from what we do not know, but is rather from what we have learned over the past 50 years. Many, as I said, many scientists are reluctant to come to this conclusion, and the reluctance is greater in some disciplines than in other disciplines. But a scientist has an obligation to follow the data wherever it leads, regardless of the philosophical implications. If the data seem to be pointing over there, that's where we go. If the data seem to be going over there, let's follow it over there. And I think that although people seem reluctant to embrace a theory of intelligent design in biology now, that progress of science will make that more or less a forced choice in a few years. The apparent design in biology just becomes more and more overwhelming with the progress we make. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I will answer any questions.
First question.
Hi. I'd like to ask you to respond to 3 brief points, none of which are original with me, but any one of which I think invalidates your argument. The first is, I think your concept of irreducible complexity doesn't take into account one of the major points of the evolutionists, which is that the component of a complex system has not necessarily, and probably has not in fact, always served the same function that it serves in that complex system. So that the system doesn't have to have been created de novo. It could have been the result of small changes from many different directions that then were able to come together in terms of a more complex system. The second point is that the fact that scientists are not currently able to explain complex systems, which they may or may not be able to be in the future, to me is certainly not an argument in favor of creation by God, for which there is even less empirical explanation. That, to me, requires a leap of faith rather than a logical deduction. And the final point is that if you accept the argument by design, that does seem to beg the question of who designed the designer. If it's legitimate to ask who designed this complex world that we have, how much more legitimate is to ask who designed God, who must be that much more complex, and then the argument just proceeds infinitely without end.
Okay, you may have to help me. My memory isn't so good. 3 points is probably 2 more than I can remember. But the first one is that perhaps the components of the system were borrowed from other systems and were not produced de novo. Yeah, that's a good point, and that's essentially what a Darwinian is really must say in the presence of irreducibly complex systems. And I should point out that irreducibly complex systems cannot be produced directly by an accumulation of parts, but perhaps they can be produced indirectly. For example, suppose the mousetrap was first a doorstop and then used for something else, and turned into a mousetrap. Well, that's okay, and one cannot rule that out because there's essentially an infinite number of pathways that one could potentially think up. But one problem is that along these different pathways, the parts somehow have to have been suspiciously adapted for their final use. For example, suppose you look at the mousetrap and say, well, it contains a spring. Well, my grandfather clock over here contains a spring as well. So let's just take that out and use that. But the spring in the grandfather clock is not the right shape, not the right length, not the right tension, and so on and so forth. And you're back to the problem of still kind of pre-adapting or somehow molding the components into the correct shape to fit into the new system. And again, I think that the onus would be on the person who proposes that such a circuitous route occurred to come up with an example of such a circuitous route and adduce some evidence for it. And if you look in the literature, that has rarely, if ever, been attempted. And the second point, I'm sorry, was?
The fact that scientists cannot come up with an explanation, to me, doesn't argue in favor of God having been the explanation, for which there's even less evidence.
Sure, okay. Science never proves anything. It's always kind of a preponderance of the evidence kind of situation. For example, suppose in the 1920s, the motion of the stars was discovered, and physicists said, gee, if you kind of mentally reverse that, maybe all the matter in the universe was concentrated into a small space, and maybe the universe started in time in a big explosion. Somebody comes up and says, yeah, but what started that explosion? Something beyond nature? Is that an argument for God? You know, how do we know God could start that explosion? And they say, let's not be hasty. Let's work and try to figure out how these redshifts in the starlight might be produced by natural phenomena and still preserve the concept of a static, unchanging universe. If they did that, they would have been out a lot of good science. The scientists in the beginning quite rightly said, we don't have to address how the Big Bang started, whether it was God, whether it was a natural event or something like that. All we do is we see this motion of the stars. We know motion implies, extrapolate in the past, it was in a smaller space, etc. I'm saying that these complex systems, irreducibly complex systems, have features in common with design systems that we see in everyday life that strongly, they really look designed. No other explanation has come forward. Well, why don't we think about the fact that they might have been designed and work with that? Science can't prove that's the case. Science can't prove that it was God that did it. Science has no way to measure God's activity. It might not have been God. The fact that these were designed does not tell us who the designer is. It's not a proof of God and is not meant to be. For example, I'm not just trying to be coy. I'd like to cite a paper by Francis Crick, the Nobel laureate. And in 1972, he and Leslie Orgel published a paper in a journal called Icarus. And the title of the paper was Directed Panspermia. And the thrust of the paper was that the problems with imagining an undirected origin of life on Earth are so great that perhaps we should consider the hypothesis that space aliens sent a rocket ship filled with spores to seed life on Earth 4 billion years ago. And this was not a momentary indiscretion. He's repeated this over the intervening decades a number of times in public. If Francis Crick wanted to think that the designer of the bacterial flagellum was a space alien, he's welcome to think so, as far as I'm concerned. I cannot point to a biochemical system and say, this is evidence that God was the designer. Most people will conclude that because of reasons they have for believing in God from other areas. But if somebody wants to think that the designer was a natural being, and that maybe could even be investigated by science at a later date, that's okay with me. So I don't think science really has to worry about the identity of the designer at this point. And what was the third?
Whether space aliens or God, the third point I think is the same, is that who designed the designer? The designer must be that much more complex, and then you can ask the same question of that, and you never reach an end to the argument.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's a question you run into frequently in this area. And I guess the answer is that it's not obvious that somebody had to design the designer, even if it was a natural one. Suppose that Francis Crick's space aliens did not consist of irreducibly complex systems. Suppose they were floating clouds of gas or electrical charges or something like that, or something we cannot even imagine, but natural phenomenon. It's, we have no way of knowing that could not occur. And the second question is, I'm no philosopher. I'm not going to argue, the properties of God or anything with anybody. There's probably a number of people more qualified to do that in this room. Another answer is that, well, maybe somebody else did design the designer, but nonetheless, the historical process by which life arose on Earth is interesting in its own right. And still the conclusion of design follows from the structure of the biochemical systems. So, these are certainly they're difficult questions, and all of these proposed answers are, strike us as being very, very odd. But, one of them is certainly true. And right now, I would say the biochemical evidence and evidence from other areas of science as well point to some designer. Yes, sir. And try the other microphone.
My background is in electrical engineering, and I've studied the theory and development of microprocessors for a number of years. And I would posit to you that if you were to look at the microprocessor of 1,000 years from now, it'd be very difficult for you to discern a transistor, let alone the interconnections of the individual components within the microprocessor. And I would say that if you were to sort of try to reverse engineer the evolution of a microprocessor, you might conclude that the system is irreducibly complex. Furthermore, you might damage one part of the microprocessor and notice that the entire processor does not function any longer. And I would say that if you look at the history of the development of the microprocessor, there is some amount of gradualism to the design, that between different versions, from the first microprocessor up until today, you have seen that different parts of the microprocessor have been added or changed, but there is an amount of gradualism. So if you use your argument of irreducible complexity to shoot down the idea of gradualism, I think that you'd have a hard time reverse engineering a microprocessor. You might actually conclude that there can be no gradualism in the development of the microprocessor. And this is only after, say, 20 or 30 years of development. Now, if you develop a microprocessor over several million years, I think that you might conclude again that the system is irreducibly complex and there must be some intelligent agent and there cannot be gradualism. And so I'm just interested to know what your opinion is, because humans have developed very complex machines and very complex systems. And I think that there is an amount of gradualism to our design, and that without one step, we cannot achieve the next step. And so you can chain these steps together, and you can argue that yes, I can see the gradualism, but if you remove certain parts of the evidence or certain parts of the chain, or you're looking from such a far time away, several thousand years or maybe even 1,000,000 years, you may not be able to find a transistor, you may not be able to find the interactions of the components, and you may conclude that the system is in fact irreducibly complex, when in fact it was developed through gradualism. So I'm wondering how you would respond to that.
Okay, well, you have the advantage. You have the advantage on me. I don't know what a transistor really looks like, much less a microprocessor. So you really have to look specifically at each system that you're considering to determine whether or not it is, in fact, irreducibly complex. So I'd have to take a look at one in the first place. The second point, two more points, is that I can't even remember my own points, let alone other people's. The second point is that, gee, I just forgot it now. The second point is that, just give me a second. What is that second point? The second point is that, well, I'll get on to the third point then. Maybe I'll remember it in the meantime. The third point is that microprocessors and transistors are intelligently designed. They are made by human agents. And it's very difficult to make analogies between intelligent activity and Darwinian, what is supposed to be a completely blind process of selection acting on chance. In many instances, I've been given other examples of things that people say look to be irreducibly complex, but really aren't. And one, forgive me for switching from your example to something else, but one people frequently say is a stone arch. I've been told that a stone arch, somebody said, I can show you a stone arch, which you cannot build stone by stone because it will fall down before it's complete. So it's irreducibly complex. It can't be put together except in its entirety. But, the person went on to say, that does not mean that God had to put it together. In fact, a stone arch is put together by first building a scaffolding and then adding the stones, and the scaffolding supports the stones until they're all put together. The scaffolding is then removed, and you have this irreducibly complex arch. And the way I respond to that, which I hope is somewhat close to your example, is that the scaffolding is a product of intelligent design. You're anticipating the final structure, and you're actually building a structure to accommodate that while you put together the stone arch. So you have to be extremely careful when you use analogies from purposeful, intentional human activity and try to say that they somehow resemble the blind process of random variation and natural selection. And if I ever remember my second point, I'll email you. And, yeah. Yes, sir.
Well, I am familiar with microprocessor design, and I know some of the designers, and I don't think any of them would consider that they're slogging around at random in designing these things. There's an awful lot of thought does go into it. There's a thought that's gone around with some of the former faculty here that theories that are attractive but not true last about 100 years, and then they go away, and the so-called unholy trinity are brought up: Darwin, Freud, and Marx. In that regard, and it seems as if Marx isn't dead, he's greatly wounded, and what has brought Marx down was experience in the laboratory of the Soviet Union and other places. And what has brought Freud down, Freud is very coruscatingly interesting and brilliant in one thing or another, but most clinical psychologists I know don't find his theories particularly useful in treating real patients. So the laboratory of the counseling room seems to have brought Freud's influence down in the latter part of this century. Darwin, unfortunately, the laboratory is in the past, and nobody has posited a time machine except in fantasy. So the question is, where will this disappear? Will the laboratory be simulations and further biochemical research? And how long will it take, really, before you can crank through these things in a scientifically plausible way and decide that it just doesn't work?
Well, I'm no prognosticator of the future, and we'll just have to see. But I think the progress of science itself is certainly causing many people, not just myself, to question the ability of Darwinian evolution to produce many of the wonders that we see, particularly in the cell. I'd just like to come a little bit to Darwin's defense. I think his idea was a good one, and who knows, it might have been true. At the stage science was in the 19th century, it had a shot. Certainly there were problems from the beginning, but people could at least hope that with the progress of science, as we learned more and more about how things really worked, maybe they could be reconciled with Darwin's theory. And the fact that progress has gone the other way and is throwing up more and more problems for Darwinism is not to his discredit. He's just another scientist who tried to make some progress. But when you talked about 100 years, I thought you were going to talk about Ernst Haeckel's drawings. You'd have a better case for that. Well, I hope that helped a little bit. Yes, sir.
I find first I want to say a wonderful presentation, very, very interesting.
Thank you.
And very thought-provoking. Do you allow for evolution in any way? And what an example that comes to mind, I haven't had the luxury of being able to think about it for as long as you have. Well, that's not true. I haven't thought about it, as long as you have.
Are you trying to say I'm old?
But something that comes to mind is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Basically, what we see is, the introduction of large-scale use of antibiotics over the course of 50 years. Now, bacterium has let's take E. coli with a generation time of 2 years. 2 hours. Very, very short. It's able to accumulate a lot of mutations over a very rapid period of time relative to our generation time of, let's say, 20 years. The synthetic antibiotics did not exist in in the universe as far as we know. They didn't exist in our world. But yet, there is now a fundamental change. Not only a change in beta-lactamase, which is appropriate for some of the naturally occurring antibiotics, but beta-lactamase has undergone genetic changes so that it's now functional on synthetic antibiotics.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I certainly do think that Darwinian evolution explains some things. It's just not, I think it doesn't explain everything. Things as you described, the development of antibiotic resistance to antibiotics is a potential, is something that Darwinian evolution potentially might explain. The only thing is that the development of antibiotic resistance doesn't seem to really be a Darwinian process. In that, Darwinian process you think of as some protein starting to accumulate mutations and et cetera, becoming better at hydrolyzing a antibiotic. But from what I read, beta-lactamase was acquired from genetic exchange of plasmids. And a plasmid carrying the gene for beta-lactamase spread through the population and was selected for by the use of antibiotics. But where that plasmid came from in the first place is not known. So it's, you might say there's a mix of Darwinian and non-Darwinian elements in there. Now, I'm not saying that, this plasmid was, zapped into existence in order to chew up our antibiotics and teach us a lesson or something like that. It might have been a protein that had some metabolic role in a regular old bacterium, some other time. It might have even, been needed to deal with a plant product. Of course, penicillin is isolated from a mold, and been co-opted when antibiotics came around. And it might have legitimately, you might legitimately look at that as a natural selection. That is, this pre-existing enzyme is now used to degrade antibiotics. But you have not yet explained where that enzyme came from in the first place and whether it was a little tiny change to go from that old enzyme to an antibiotic hydrolase, or whether a lot of mutation. If it was just a tiny step, or a comparatively tiny step, then I'm happy to say that's Darwinian microevolution. It's only when you start to say produce a brand new protein or something more complicated that I start to question whether Darwinian evolution can explain that.
I don't want to take any more time. It's just, if you accept Darwinian evolution, even in the smallest sense, then an argument can be made, similar to the gentleman before me, that what we now see as irreducible complexity really isn't. It's dangerous to if you can accept Darwinian evolution in the smallest sense, you can then extrapolate back that the grander changes can be made, but on a time scale that we're not cognizant of. And one more thing, the genetic knockouts that have become very popular in the last couple of years have shown, probably more of them have shown that you can knock out certain genes of your irreducibly complex machinery and have no discernible effect on the phenotype. Most of these studies don't get published because negative data doesn't get published. So some of these irreducibly complex machines can lose some of their parts.
Okay, you have to be careful. You can't toss around this phrase here and there. You have to be careful. You have to inspect the system. A lot of systems have redundant parts. If if a tire on my auto goes flat, I can still drive a fair distance with the 3 tires. If all 4 of them go flat, I'm in bad shape. So certainly the auto needs a tire or 2 or something like that. But redundant systems can be built in. It's not clear how Darwinian evolution would explain redundant systems, however, and I've read a number of people who wonder how to explain that within the Darwinian paradigm. But for irreducible complexity, you can't just snap your fingers and say, boy, look how complex that is. It needs all its parts. You have to go through and understand what the parts are doing, and only then can you say, this might be a mixture of necessary parts plus extras. Only after an examination, only when you know what the structure of the system is, then can you say, these are the components that are really necessary for the irreducibly complex system, and there might be some extras on there as well. Okay. Yes?
The first point is, like you point out, the apparent intelligent design, but there's one of the things that's been recognized since Darwin's time is the monstrous stupidity of some of the designs that are present in nature. And I'm sure you've heard this argument before, but things like flight feathers on the wings of birds. Now, in some species, like ostriches, these may be used in display, but in many species, they serve absolutely no purpose. So if you postulate that the flightless birds came from a flying bird, you can explain some of this, but this does not seem like intelligent design to have things like leftover wing claws on some species of birds, or leftover flight feathers, or leftover pieces of pelvic girdle in snakes and in whales. This does not seem like intelligent design. It seems like oh, well, I suppose it could be a rather stupid intelligent designer, but it does not imply like an omnipotent designer by any means.
Or something like that.
Another thing is, well, like the aliens. I'm not saying anything about God or anything. I'm just saying like it could be intelligent, but not very well done.
Mork on a bad day.
Another thing is we can't observe natural selection in action today. I mean, one of my professors she and her husband go to the Galapagos Islands, and they observe finch evolution. They observe how the interactions of rainfall influence seeds and seed distribution, and how this modifies things like beak size or size of the birds. And as mentioned, of course, the many examples of bacteria which are resistant to drugs. Then, of course, you have things like the AIDS virus, which apparently the means by which it overcomes the immune system is rapidly out-evolving the immune system. It is able to mutate at a mutation rate that's something like, I believe it's like 1 million times the mutation rate of the average human being. And so it's able to, and some of these mutations, of course, are beneficial. So it's able to evolve circles around the immune system's attempts to put it down. And finally, I guess what I'd like to say is I think the fundamental flaw here is you're saying that an irreducibly complex structure cannot be derived from a reducibly complex structure. It is possible, for example, the point of the scaffold argument is that this irreducibly complex structure has been taken from a structure. Now, this is regardless of whether it's been created by a human or processes of natural selection. This irreducibly complex structure has been taken from a structure which was before reducibly complex. And it may be that other biochemical pathways or other proteins may have existed upon which the various components of these systems were assembled. And that in this system, and in this way, these various pieces may have been placed in one by one, each one of which would have increased the survival ability of the animal, and finally, in which the original system around which it was all built is no longer necessary and eliminated. And in that sense, you have not done what you said must be done to refute Darwin, and you have not said that we have demonstrated conclusively that there are things that exist that simply cannot be explained by Darwinism.
Okay. Good. Stay there. You can remind me of the points that you made. I'm sure I'll forget most of them. But taking the last one first, science can't prove anything conclusively. And to the extent that my idea is scientific, it is tentative. Just like the Big Bang Theory is tentative. Big Bang Theory might be overturned next week. My ideas might be overturned next week. That's just the way science works. It is not logic. It is not mathematics. It does not present deductive proofs. Right now, I don't think so. I think the evidence is very good for it. I think it's the way to go, and I think science should follow wherever the evidence lead. Even if you don't think intelligent design is good, maybe even in the future you think that it will be overturned or something. I would argue as a scientist you should still follow that data where it leads, because you won't make progress by ignoring what seems to be an obvious conclusion in the hopes that something better will come along. The road to progress sometimes goes through models which later seem to be not true, but you have to go through them. let me say I don't think that will happen to intelligent design. I think that's the final truth. But the second point about the irreducible complexity of the arch, I'd have to argue with you about that. I would argue that, I would bet you that that this scaffolding structure is never spelled out. And that might be irreducibly complex too. And whether or not it is, all we have shown is that humans can put together irreducibly complex structures, which we knew in the first place. Can you remind me of your first point?
The first point is the fact that there are adaptations which, this is not, it argues that intelligent design, if it is intelligent design, is not very good intelligent design in the sense that there are adaptations are present that are completely useless, like on an emu, which is about 3 foot tall hips. You have these tiny little arms that are 3 inches long. They're completely useless for any purpose. Why are they there? This does not seem to be an animal which has been designed by an intelligent designer, like, this animal needs 3-inch long, completely useless arms.
Okay. The existence of feathers and such things on emus is, I think, a good argument for common descent. That is, it came from some animal that used its arms, that had feathers. But evolution, Darwinian evolution, is not the same thing as common descent. Darwin's claim to fame, the notion of common descent was floated long before Darwin. His claim to fame was that he had thought of a mechanism that would power these changes. I mean, in the absence of mechanism, common descent is like, looking at Dr. Jekyll turning into Mr. Hyde and saying, don't worry, that's just evolution, we'll explain how it happens later, but it's common descent. It's astonishing, and we should be astonished by it. So stuff like feathers on all birds, even flightless birds, might be explained well by common descent. But that does not address how feathers got there in the first place. Maybe a better example of what you're thinking about is something like, say, the blind spot in the vertebrate eye. A number of people point to that. The vertebrate eye, the nerves coming from the retina, actually the retina is on the back like the film of your eye, and it comes out, instead of going back towards the brain, it comes out, and the nerves circle around and go through a hole in the retina and then go back the optic nerve to the brain. And many, well, not many, a number of people have pointed to this and said this looks like an example of poor design. What kind of an intelligent designer would arrange things in that way? And typically I respond that, well, I don't know is the answer. But that, you cannot say that looks like poor design. Therefore, retinal, rhodopsin, phosphodiesterase, all the other elements of the visual cascade, therefore arose by natural selection. It's just a non sequitur. Additionally, it depends on the assumption that this arrangement does not have a functional use. And in fact, a number of ophthalmologists have argued that this apparently backwards wiring is necessary for the rod cells to get a large supply of blood and to slough off the dead rod cells because they are used up quickly in the high light environment that vertebrates typically occupy. So I call that the argument from imperfection. And while it seems to have some force with a lot of people, it doesn't, to me, explain how the complexity got there in the first place. Even, there are animals with blind eyes. There are, blind mole rats and blind cavefish. And you can say, well, maybe they were derived from functioning eyes. But, how breaking a functioning structure is not a hard thing to explain. It's building it up in the first place. And I read about your advisors in the Beak of the Finch, if I'm not mistaken. And it's fascinating work, it really is. But I don't think it's evolution. Evolution has two parts. It has random variation and natural selection, which has to become, it has to have random mutation and natural selection. From my take on it, the variation was already there in the bird population, and that there was certainly natural selection going on, but it's not clear that the variation was being produced by new mutations.
Darwin doesn't say that they have to be produced by new mutations. He merely says that variation is there.
At some point they do.
And what Darwin did not really explain necessarily evolution in the sense that, like any change in the genetic makeup of a population, the random death of individuals, which will cause a change in the genetic makeup, that's evolution. The important thing he explained was adaptation, which is why is for the form-fitting function, that type of thing. And that does appear to be what is being observed.
Okay.
We have time for just 2 more short questions, but we will be up here afterwards. Just so people ask
Okay.
questions.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Okay. First, I'd like to say I think this has been an interesting discussion, and that you basically have a good idea here, and both sides have made good arguments, and I can admire and sympathize with your point of view and intentions. But what I'd like to talk about is not just going back and forth no, it isn't irreducibly complex. Yes, it is, or whatever. But rather, my problem is with how this debate's been presented, because from my point of view, it doesn't really have anything or that much to do with religion, because religion and science are fundamentally different in that there is nothing you could prove to make a religious person not be religious. It's basically summed up by Dostoevsky's statement in the book The Possessed, and one of his characters says, if it was proven that God didn't exist, I would give up believing in the truth so that I could believe in God. And the real problem is the same forces of skepticism or of Occam's razor or whatever principles you use to attack the idea of complete random design and can be applied to religion with the same destructive effects. And religion requires a suspension of disbelief in any form that it's practiced, just as the suspension of disbelief that's practiced by a Darwinist. So I just like to say that basically you can only go so far arguing into intelligent design, you come up with saying something exists, whether it's God or space aliens, and then you can argue about whether God or space aliens is more likely. But you can't get beyond that, and I think the religious discussion is different. Well, in my view, atheism isn't the main challenge to religion. That's mainly a 19th and early 20th century phenomenon, and the real challenge to most organized religions today are sort of individual spiritualism and things, which still could believe in intelligent design or not believe in it, and that is where the religious debate is taking place, and trying to make scientific arguments and then present them as having something to do with religion is like taking a hammer and chisel to a mountain. You'll carve out a little bit, but the mountain's still going to be there no matter how much you try. And the only way to get rid of the mountain's with lots of dynamite.
Okay, I agree with you to a large extent, but I'm not trying to make a religious argument. I'm trying to make just a scientific one. But I think it's a little bit underestimating things to say that science and religion have nothing to do with each other. Science and religion both make claims about the world to one extent or another. And to the extent that the claims support what the religion claims, it seems more credible to people. And to the extent that it doesn't, it seems less credible. And certainly many Darwinist popularizers who are also atheists try to point out this distinction. For example, Richard Dawkins argues quite strongly that the data of science are not compatible with the claims specifically of Christianity. But he may be incorrect in saying that they are incompatible, and I think he is incorrect in saying that. But nonetheless, he seems to think that he's making a case against religion from empirical scientific data. And if Christianity makes a claim about an historical event, like the fact that Christ rose from the dead, and some archaeologist digs up the bones of in a tomb labeled Jesus of Nazareth, then the claims of Christianity could be thrown into serious disarray. So any system of thought that makes claims about the real world is vulnerable to the investigations of science. Of course, science itself is tentative, and its claims might change over time, but they can, in theory, support or argue against the claims, the historical claims of religion. Yes, sir.
I'd just like to say I've tried to use all means to either convince or at least have people ask themselves the proper questions. I think that science is certainly a tool that needs to be used by those who believe in God or some intelligent being, as well as any other tool. And if we were to give up using science and go back to quoting Bible verse, we wouldn't get very far. There are certainly, every time I hold a baby, it seems to confirm my belief in God. But I wanted to say, we would be a lot farther along in science if people didn't spend time trying to prove their biases rather than solid theories. And as far as the stone and the arch, I was going to say, if you had some good old boy scientists from Montana, say, go out to the Rockies and explode enough pieces of mountain and try to create a stone arch that way, you'd be a lot closer to proving these random, possibilities than if you were to try to banter back and forth and really not get anywhere. But one would think the development of computers that we have now that can do these billions of calculations, and I don't come from a scientific background, but I read as much as I can and don't tend to believe a lot of what my professors say. But one would think the development of these supercomputers would advance the powers of the extrapolation of probabilities to the point where you could create almost a virtual environment and set these things in motion and try to see if you could ever come up with these amino chains or these really almost impossible series of events to occur to even create an amoeba. And I was wondering if any mathematicians have addressed this, if there's any computer models that have been created to try to do this. So we're talking what's available to us now and in the next 5-10 years is just light years ahead of what it was even 20 years ago. And is anybody actively pursuing this avenue?
Well, yeah, I think the short answer is yes, and the other short answer is no. There is a discipline called artificial life, in which computer jocks try to make systems that they think are lifelike in the computer. And they have programs that they write, and they have the programs replicate by in the computer and do various tricks. I find them to be very unconvincing, and I don't know of any real biologist who thinks that they come close to imitating real live systems. The computers are very, very fast and powerful, but they still don't come close to being able to replicate the natural world in detail. You'd have to have rocks over here and meteors potentially coming in from space with amino acids in them, and gamma rays coming from outer space, and no, if the results come up negative, any believer in an unintelligent origin of life would just say, well, you haven't gotten your conditions right. We'll just search harder for those conditions. So essentially, something like that is almost impossible to falsify. But with time and with the failure of these folks to come up with something which does more than draw neat pictures on the computer screen, more and more people get skeptical about their efforts.
One last question.
Snuck in under the wire.
I we've talked tonight about using complex systems to do jobs. One of the things I'm wondering, though, is whether it might not be useful to ask whether the job itself is necessarily complex. If,
Okay.
in principle, like it seems to me like it's something that can only be answered for sure in one direction. But if, in principle, it's impossible to produce sight with a system that's not irreducibly complex, then that's it.
Well, it's not
Well,
it.
well,
The question
what
is,
do you
where
think?
did the real system come from? Yeah, certainly there are different ways to do the same job. For example, locomotion. You know, bacteria have different ways of, or single-celled creatures have different ways of locomotion. They have cilia, they have amoeboid movements, and you know, vertebrates can slither and they can walk and do things like that. The question is, well, and that's a good question. I think it's definitely true. You can approach the same job by different ways. And maybe some of them are irreducibly complex. You know, you can use to catch a mouse, you don't need the mechanical mousetrap I have there. You can use a glue trap. People say this is cruel, but I never use them. I just use them in an example. You put out a glue trap, like I do in my garage, and the mice run on it and they get stuck and they die. They starve. You've got yourself a mousetrap. But is that the precursor to the mechanical mousetrap that I showed in the slide? And if it is, nobody knows how you can transform a glue trap into that mechanical mousetrap. So the question that I think is the really interesting one is we've got real biological systems here. And whether or not the jobs could be done some other way or even some simpler way, question is, could these real systems have been produced in a step-by-step Darwinian fashion? Thanks.